classical setup of the queen's gambit, which begins with the moves pawn to d4, pawn to d5, pawn to c4, pawn to e6. From here, both sides develop their knights. White develops the knight to c3, and black develops the knight to f6. In this position, the most common move for white is to develop the bishop to g5. In response, black usually plays bishop to e7, entering the main line of the queen's gambit. However, white has a clever way to slightly trick black by changing the move order. Instead of immediately playing bishop to g5, white can first develop the knight to f3. Strategically, this does not change much, since bishop to g5 will often follow anyway, but it can create a small amount of confusion. In this position, one of the most common responses from black is to play bishop to b4, pinning white's knight on c3. While this move is playable and even used by grandmasters, it is also a frequent mistake made by beginners. If you are playing this position as black, it is usually best to avoid bishop to b4, as it can lead to trouble if not handled correctly. This move creates a more imbalanced position where black pins the knight on c3. Although this pin may look appealing, it introduces tricky variations that require a solid understanding of opening theory. When grandmasters play bishop to b4, they know how to counterattack in the center at the right moment. Beginners, however, often choose this move simply because it looks aggressive, without having a clear follow-up plan, and that is where it can backfire. After black plays bishop to b4, white can respond with bishop to g5, pinning the knight on f6. Now black cannot comfortably play bishop to a7 to break the pin, and retreating the bishop from b4 is rarely considered, which can leave black in an awkward position. Meanwhile, white can easily castle kingside, neutralizing the pin on the knight and securing the king, while maintaining a more pleasant and flexible position overall. Let us look at how this position typically develops. Black castles kingside, white responds with pawn to e3, black brings the knight to d7, white develops the bishop to d3, black challenges the center with pawn to c5, and white then castles kingside. With the king safely placed, the pin on the knight on c3 is completely neutralized and no longer poses any real danger. At this point, black must seriously question the usefulness of the bishop on b4. If black chooses to exchange this bishop for the knight on c3, it usually turns into a positional concession. In most cases, a bishop is slightly more valuable than a knight, and making this trade only strengthens white's structure and piece coordination, effectively helping white reach a more comfortable and harmonious position. After the exchange, white can recapture with the b-pawn, bringing the pawn closer to the center and strengthening control over important central squares. The doubled pawns on the c-file are not a true weakness for white, since they can often be exchanged later in the game or used to support central play. If black tries to counterattack in the center by capturing the pawn on d4, white is well prepared. The pawn on c3 provides strong support, allowing white to recapture and maintain a solid pawn structure. Although the position is not immediately winning for white, from a strategic point of view, black is already playing from an inferior position. This position can be very dangerous for black because white possesses the bishop pair, and both bishops are extremely powerful, controlling long diagonals and large areas of the board. In addition, white has strong central control with two central pawns against black's single central pawn. White also has open files available for the rooks, which can be used very effectively after playing queen to c2 and doubling the rooks on the central or c-file. This leads to a very active and dominant position for white, making it difficult for black to fully equalize. Now here's an important strategic idea to remember. Wait for your opponent to develop their bishop before capturing the pawn on c4. Why is this important? Black often does not need to capture the pawn on c4 immediately, or sometimes not at all. However, if black chooses to take the pawn after white has already moved the bishop, it forces white to lose a tempo when recapturing or repositioning, giving black a small but valuable improvement in development and coordination. Black proceeds in a calm and flexible manner, continuing with natural development such as bishop to e7, while waiting for white to commit the bishop to g5. Black castles kingside, white answers with pawn to e3, and black develops the knight to d7, steadily completing development. During this time, black can also improve the placement of the queen or the queenside bishop without rushing into any concrete action, while keeping the option of capturing the pawn on c4 in mind. This patient strategy helps black avoid unnecessary early commitments, preserve a solid and harmonious position, and wait for the most convenient moment to strike back in the center, disrupting white's pawn structure and piece coordination under more favorable circumstances. White must eventually move the light-squared bishop in order to complete development and castle. The moment white does this is the perfect time for black to capture the pawn on c4. This forces white to place the bishop on c4 in 2 moves instead of 1, allowing black to gain a small but valuable tempo advantage. Another common scenario occurs after black plays pawn to c5, challenging white's center. Later, black may capture the pawn on d4, and white must choose how to recapture. Recapturing with the queen simplifies the position and reduces white's winning chances, so it is usually not recommended. Recapturing with the knight keeps the pawn structure symmetrical and leads to a slower, more positional game, while placing the knight on a strong central square. If white recaptures with the pawn from e3 to d4, it creates an isolated pawn on d4 with no neighboring pawn support. Over time, this pawn can become a target for black's knights, queen, and possibly a rook on an open file. White also gains several advantages in this structure. The semi-open file allows white to activate a rook easily, and the absence of a pawn on e3 frees the light-squared bishop to develop to active squares such as g5 or f4. Although the isolated pawn on d4 can become a long-term weakness, white's piece activity often compensates for it. For black, a key strategic idea in this structure is advancing the queenside pawns. The simplest method of developing the light-squared bishop is by playing pawn to b6, followed by bishop to b7. This setup is solid and reliable, but it often leads to a passive position, with several of black's pieces remaining on the back rank and limited in activity. A more ambitious alternative is the advance fan strategy. In this plan, black first exchanges the pawn on c4, but only after white has already developed the light-squared bishop, forcing white to lose a tempo. Black then plays pawn to a6, preparing pawn to b5 to attack white's bishop, gain space on the queenside, and generate more active play. After white's bishop retreats, black develops the light-squared bishop, usually to b7, where it controls a long diagonal and supports the expanding queenside pawn structure. This placement significantly improves black's piece activity and long-term pressure. With pawns on b5 and potentially b4, black gains several practical options. The move pawn to b4 can chase the knight on c3 away from its strong central post, while pawn to c5 can challenge the center directly and open lines for the rooks and the queen. These ideas help black seize more space and keep white under constant pressure. Choosing this setup transforms black's position from passive to dynamic. Compared to the quieter pawn to b6 structure, having a pawn on b5 provides greater flexibility, a possible outpost on b5 for a knight, and strong support for further queenside expansion with moves like pawn to c4 or pawn to b4. Overall, the advance fan gives black an active, well-coordinated position heading into the middle game. Now let us briefly look at the role of the rooks. In the Queen's Gambit, both sides usually place their rooks on the c-file and the d-file, since these files are often open or will open after pawn exchanges. White commonly starts with rook to c1, then plays queen to e2, clearing the d1 square for the other rook. Black can follow a similar plan. After completing development, black can play rook to c8 to contest the c-file. When white places a rook on d1, creating pressure against the queen, black can simply move the queen to a safe square and then play rook to d8. With both rooks centralized on the c-file and d-file, black is fully prepared for central battles and future exchanges, reflecting the strategic depth typical of the Queen's Gambit. Thanks for watching.